We now finish off with a final summary panel, and there's been a slight change in the batting order. I'll chair it, and we'll have Chris Chamberlain, Sharon Parkinson, Shelley Mallett and Cameron Parsell give us their thoughts about the way ahead from, I think, both a sector perspective, a service, or I think from the perspective how best to meet the needs of homeless people as people, and also give us their perspective, I'm sure, about the way ahead in terms of research, because researchers can't help but talk about research. So who'd like to go first?
No, I went first yesterday. It's you, Chris.
No, I didn't know we were meant to say anything.
So you're a volunteer, are you, Cameron?
I went first yesterday, actually, Andrew.
And you'll be good at it today as well. Off you go.
All right, then. Thank you very much for that opportunity, Andrew. I appreciate that.
Mark it down as personal growth.
Okay. I wasn't listening to what Andrew said then because I was waiting to see what Shelley said and then model what I was going to say based on what she said. But in the absence of being able to do that, I think some of the interesting ways forward that I can look at or perhaps identify is a discussion between researchers and policy and sector stakeholders about how research can best be embedded within the diverse bodies and types of approaches, programs, policies that are on the ground, how research can most appropriately identify, measure, test, and disseminate some of the complex and the nuanced components of interventions, of service provision, of models, in ways that are not easily captured in a lot of the research we do. So I guess what I'm suggesting is that it needs to be a greater need, not only so that researchers are able to produce evidence that speaks to the needs of policy, but also so they can construct research designs and research projects that are producing the type of evidence and the information, the knowledge that people working on the ground know that they need. And in many respects, it is the people that are working in these programs that know the questions that need to be asked. And I think there was a good point made during one of the discussions I had about what we don't know from the evidence kind of reifies these assumptions about who is or who isn't the deserving or the known homeless, particularly around the invisibility of women and the way that our focus on the minority of rough sleeping males can kind of perpetuate these ideas of what constitutes the real homelessness, when of course it's much more complicated and diverse than that. And we need to make sure that we're constructing research in a way that identifies these issues that are not necessarily easily seen, and also in a way that produces evidence that's going to be most useful and relevant for people on the ground. I was in the stakeholder panel earlier on this afternoon. I was interested in the extent to which they saw research informing their practice, or whether they saw research as useful for the things that they do, or whether they saw a need for a different type of research that they could use in a way to advance their practice. And I guess that greater relationship and conversation between researchers and people in the sector, I think, would be a useful way forward.
Great. Thank you very much. Shelley, would you care to go second?
Thanks, Andrew, for that opportunity. I don't want to talk about research much, really, even though I pretend to be one. I wanted to pick up on something that I forgot to say, and then talk a little bit about some learning that I've had over the last 18 months in relation to FOIA. First thing was to say that one thing that I've omitted, I had written down but omitted, was to talk about domestic violence, because given that over the vast majority of women that come into the sector come in because of issues to do with domestic violence, then clearly it's a policy domain with tentacles into other policy domains that we have to address as a sector, and we have to address it at the early intervention and prevention end, which takes us into, at the prevention end, it takes us into very different spaces altogether, into social marketing campaigns, education in schools, educations in preschool, right from the very beginning about the very nature of our gender relationships. It takes us into thinking about what we do in relation to men who continue to be neglected in the equation, and the relationship between men and women continue to be neglected in the equation. And it also, of course, takes us into regulation, and so trying to get some nationally agreed and consistent regulation in relation to things like protection orders, etc., across the country, into good data collection for police that's consistent across the country as well. So it takes us in very many directions, but I think nothing short of having that framework bringing to domestic violence is going to be really critical. And then when it gets down to our end of the bargain in terms of tertiary intervention or secondary intervention in relation to women and children experiencing it, we have to think about more broadly and consistent practice. We've had safe-at-home models that have been quite successfully trialled in various jurisdictions. But we also need to think about it. How is it that we're going to enable women to be independent and safe, independent, and with the capability again to build their own lives? And so, of course, that means that we're going to have to connect women to training and work and skill building. Not all of them, of course, because it cuts across the socio-economic divide, and some women are better skilled to engage in the workforce, but others aren't. But nothing less than that's going to be very important. And then at the children's end of it, we know that what's absolutely crucial in all of the children's research is that the stability of parents or parent has a really big impact on how the child experiences. So not only do we have to do some work around the trauma that children experience, but what do they have to achieve in that particular life stage? Well, they have to achieve engagement with school and community, so that they can normalise their life. So we have to make sure that our response to children is not merely confined to the children's specialist worker in the women's refuge, but that it has a greater ambition around that. Now that involves work with schools critically, childcare, playgroups, etc. But I think that's really important. So that's just a few comments about domestic violence. One of the things that, in fact, what I would say is I've had a fairly varied career. I was calculating it the other day. I've had 5 different careers, and but just thinking about it, the thing that has really been the best thing that I've done in my whole working life, I've done in the last 18 months, which has been involved in the service development and build for the Education First Youth foyers in Victoria, which, as Wendy indicated, is kind of new iterational model of foyer. Now, I'm not particularly interested in talking about foyer as such, but simply something that I learned in the journey that I think has broader applicability around the service development. And we started from a different premise in the foyer, where we decided that we'd learn from some colleagues in the UK from the Foyer Federation, who championed a framework for action called Open Talent. Absolutely naff name, when we could never come up with something different. But what it really signalled was an advantage thinking approach, and you will have kind of heard echoes of it in my talk earlier today. I don't think it's the be-all and end-all of everything, but nevertheless I've learnt many things in the process of having to really work with the concept. And essentially it starts from solution, working on managing solutions rather than focusing on problems. Now, what that doesn't mean is that, so I like to think of that as, so it's very interested in building people's human capital and their social capital. So the links, the bonding, bridging and linking networks that are going to enable people to get along and get on and make a go of their lives. And what it does say is it doesn't ignore the fact that people have issues that need to be managed, so mental health issues, drug and alcohol issues, experience of trauma, etc. But it says what we put in the focus of our endeavour is trying to build capability and recognise capability and build on that. And what we put in the background around it is the dealing with the managing of the problems. So the managing of the problems aren't front and centre. They're in the background of what we do. Now that is a fundamental shift in our orientation, and what it leads you to start thinking about is, well, again, how do you connect into the mainstream? So if it's education or if it's employment, how do you build those skills and capabilities that many of, as we've seen from the statistics today, that many who come into the homeless sector don't have in terms of their basic education. You'll see, I mean, I was looking at education and employment stats across the presentations, and 60% in almost every presentation, particularly they're at a very hard end that we were talking about, but have got year 11 or less in terms of education. So what an advantage thinking approach says is these people, despite where they come from, they have an absolute entitlement to be in the mainstream. Then we have to enable them to get there and be there. Moreover, we have to think about their health and well-being. We have to shift our the way that we think about their health and well-being away from just focusing on the mental illness, into focusing on mental well-being, emotional well-being, etc. And I think there's many other models around health and well-being other than simply an illness focus that we can draw on to complement that work. So just a few comments about that.
Thank you very much, Shelley. I think we'll go to Chris next.
I don't really have anything wise to say. One of the things that really concerns me at the moment, as in really worries me, are the proposals to severely restrict unemployment benefits, particularly for people who are under 30, and to effectively cut people off for 6 months. There are lots of young people floating around who are not working, and they're also not in families. They're kind of on the margins. And I think if the government pursues this policy, if it can get the legislation through the Senate and so forth, I actually think this is going to make the problems that we look at considerably worse, because those kids who are cut off from unemployment benefits, particularly if they've got if they've got family support, it's going to increase tensions in family. If I'm a stepdad and my partner, and we've got a couple of her kids who are unemployed, things are going to get more cross, and they're bringing in no money. If they're not in the family unit, I mean, how are they going to survive? And I think there are 3 options. One is dealing, one is stealing, and the other is sex work. And I think that if those policies which the government are promoting actually come to fruition, I actually think that all of you who work on the front line are actually going to be a lot busier. I mean, and this is to do basically with structural things that are out there that are outside of our control. I don't really know how one wins the argument with a government that is intent on doing those things. I mean, I've got 2 kind of possible angles. One is to say, I mean, you can say politically, we don't want a visible underclass like you get in the United States. If any of you have been to the United States in the last 10 or so years, as you travel through some of the big American cities, you see the visible underclass. And what's happened in the States is there are lots of people who are chronically homeless. In other words, they've been on the streets and on the margins for years. And when that problem gets in long term, it's very difficult to solve. Now, if you go back historically, that wasn't an issue in the 1970s in the States. The issue that you see in the States began in the middle to the late 1980s. So it is sort of historically contingent, but it kind of worries me that if some of the things that are proposed happen, we will slowly start to see a problem like that here in Australia. The only other angle I've got to think about this, I heard someone talking yesterday about saying perhaps one angle those of us who, are political should take is to push the human rights idea that everybody has a right to decent housing and all kids have a right to decent housing. Back when the Burdekin report came out in 1989, that was the Burdekin argument, that there were rights that had to be given to people. Whether that's going to work in the current context, I don't know. So my little rave is really to say, I really do think there are some serious indicators that the numbers could actually get a lot larger because of what they're planning to do. Because I can't see how these young people who are going to be cut off benefits, I can't see how they're going to survive.
Thank you very much. Sharon, I think it's your turn now.
Okay, my turn. I think I think we need to focus on two critical things, which is the labour market and the private rental market. And I think we need to take seriously that there has been fundamental systemic change in the labour market that we take for granted and that we accept. And we accept that we've got a highly casualised workforce, that we've got a highly underemployed workforce, and it doesn't get challenged in the way that it should. People should be quite angry about the level of disadvantage that there is in the workforce and how that is being reinforced in the private rental market. The most insecure in this market segment are those who are casually employed in the private rental market. We need to take this issue seriously. The J2SI program spent a lot of energy investing in training and capability, and quite a few went through courses, they got certificates. There's a dead end. There's nothing for them to go to. The jobs that they end up going to, they fall out of because they're casual. There's no security in those jobs, and it's accepted. And it needs to be challenged in a more systemic way that really looks at the relationship between work and housing, and some of the research that Rosanna's doing is critical to make those broader structural links and tie it back to the work that we do. Otherwise, you're just setting people up to fail. As they go through these intensive support programs, they go through, a lot of money is invested to nothing. We need to reform the private rental market system so that it is actually a secure place for people to live, particularly as public housing is being transferred into that space. So we need to develop better relationships with real estate agents and landlords to be prepared to take responsibility for security of housing, and to open that conversation and debate of how that sector can develop to create a better future.
Thank you very much, Sharon. Now, it's my considerable pleasure to open up the floor for questions or comments. So, over here, do we have...
As we know, women are overrepresented in the homelessness sector, and we also know that domestic violence is the number one reason cited. And I guess this is a comment. When we are talking about addressing homelessness, I think it is absolutely critical that issue is very visible. The experiences of women, particularly for our sector, is not about not being able to sustain a house or sustain a tenancy. It's actually about not being safe in their own home. And I think it was also mentioned on the panel, it is about being really courageous and at looking at new models and what is it that we're doing to address that violence. And that means how is it that we engage the man that uses that violence. And it isn't only about us as a sector, but it's obviously engaging, the whole system in addressing that issue. And I think also somebody mentioned their frustration about the budget and its impact on youth, which is extremely frustrating as well. But women are extremely disadvantaged by this budget, and they're disadvantaged through obviously benefits, co-payments when women are carers and they're taking their children to the doctors, childcare rebates, and also cuts to legal community centres, which are critical to provide women with support around domestic violence. So it is a comment, and I think it's really, really critical that we don't forget the realities for women and children. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other questions? Hero over there.
Very much. Excuse me, I've got a frog in my throat. I hope I'm not asking too many questions, but there's no one else who wants to jump in front of me. I have a hypothetical. I work in the specialist homeless service sector, so this is sort of bringing, I guess, the thinking perhaps back to a smaller part of the sector. I know homelessness sector is broader than just the specialist homelessness sector, but I just think, and if any of the panel members would like to respond to this, please do. If you could wave a magic wand and had the knife to carve up the funding pie, what proportion would you allocate to where? And that's, you know, thinking about the service models, you know, outreach versus agency-based services, housing, supportive housing packages, population groups, rural, regional remote split, early intervention. How would you carve up that pie?
Well, that's an easy one. Well done. But I will throw it to the panel now. Chris?
Carefully. I don't think I'm qualified to answer that question. I mean, well, I will make one point. All right, I won't make one point.
So come on.
No, I'm shy. All right, I will make a point that's quite serious. As you know, the ABS has changed the definition of homelessness. Now, after the white paper in 2008, the money was allocated to the states under the NAHA, the National Associated Housing Agreement. It was allocated according to the number of persons counted as homeless at the 2006 census, using the cultural definition. And it's now been the definition has now been changed. There are many consequences of this, but one consequence is it changes the numbers in the different states and territories. Now, if the money to the states and territories were to be allocated using the figures provided by the ABS for the 2011 census, one state and one territory would benefit, and the other 6 would lose out. The Northern Territory, I mean, I have to do these figures from the back of my head, would get about a 14% increase in funding, and Western Australia would get about a 1% increase in funding. New South Wales would lose money, Victoria would lose money, South Australia would lose money, Tasmania would lose money, and whichever ones I've left out, Western Australia. And it's a consequence of the new definition of homelessness, because the new definition of homelessness includes people in the housed population. It redefines being in an overcrowded dwelling as being homeless. Now, I'm sure there will be debate about this, but it seems to me that overcrowding is different from homelessness. But the decision to change the definition will have consequences down the track on how money flows to the states and territories, because the overcrowding problem is very disproportionately in the Northern Territory. So that is one factor that will bear on how much money different states get in the future. I'm trying to remember South Australia's figure, and I think you come down from 5.9% of the homeless population to 4.7. I know New South Wales comes down from about 29 point something to 23 point something, and so on. So there are very, very serious consequences of the decision to change the definition of homelessness.
Shelley, I think you had a response to Hero's heroic question.
Hero, that's a shocker. I guess I sort of signalled it this morning, where a few years ago I was involved in doing some work with Dorothy Scott, who some of you may know is a researcher who's sort of led the way in child protection research across the country. And part of her work She published a lot of things, Think Child, Think Family, various stuff. But really what she was going on about was trying to reorient the child protection service system, which is very difficult because it's a system premised on mitigating risk, and where the consequence of not mitigating that risk are dire. But she really tried to affect a shift in the proportion of funding that went into tertiary intervention versus early intervention and prevention. And many of you will have seen that triangle that says, you know, the bulk of it, 80% or so, sits at the tertiary end. And there's this thin little apex at the top on early intervention. Well, it seems to me that nothing short of trying to invert the apex, not to the 80-20 rule, I think that's too ambitious in the first instance, but I do think that we need to make some hard, concerted decisions around the early intervention. Why? Because we've got major structural adjustments coming ahead of us in the economy and in the housing market, and it's hard to see in the next decade that we will have a bigger funding envelope for our sorts of service delivery. So we need to turn off the tap, which is, you know, the great rhetoric of the white paper, but somehow we need to, you know, turn off the tap. And so to my mind, we need to reorient it towards much more towards early intervention and prevention. Whether we're involved in the prevention or we mobilise others to do it is another question, but I certainly think we need to do more early intervention.
Thank you very much, Shelley. Is there perhaps a less ambitious question or comment out there for our panel? Yes, over there. If you wouldn't mind waiting till the microphone gets you.
So just on the funding changes and decrease in funding, social impact bonds, social investment coming from private capital, philanthropics, what are your thoughts there in terms of that early intervention stuff? Thinking of child protection in particular, NewPen, what's happening over in New South Wales? Do you see that happening now in terms of early intervention and decreasing homelessness and housing issues?
So I'd like to take that one up.
Sharon? I can take that up.
Sharon, would you mind speaking to that one?
I think there is potential for social impact bonds for the early intervention, and there are certainly international models that are starting to look at that in the homelessness space. It started off in the criminal justice space, but is moving into the homelessness area. The scary thing is how we define the outcomes, because it is outcome based. That is the number one question. So if you're going to be funding innovation and corporate investment on outcomes, they're going to necessarily want to choose maybe some potentially easier groups or easier outcomes. And I think we need to work through that in a little bit more detail about how you actually get interest in the really hardcore issues as well. I can't see them wanting to support the highly intensive heroin dependent groups, for instance. So, you know, is it only going to be an early intervention space where they fund school-based initiatives, or where is it going to sit? But there is huge potential, I think, to explore that, as is social enterprise and other sorts of funding arrangements.
Okay. Thank you very much. Any other questions or comments? Yes, we have a question over there.
My name's Nicole Harb. I'm a PhD candidate at Flinders University. My question is about risk and discrimination in the private rental market. It seems to me that a lot of the discrimination that goes on is based around the fact that most of our landlords in Australia are what are termed mum and dad landlords and rely very heavily on their rental income. And it's the risk averseness, the financial risk, the litigious risk that prevents them from renting to a lot of the disadvantaged groups we've been discussing today. When we heard from St John's Youth Service about the success of their tenancy guarantee programs and thinking about institutional landlords overseas that would seem to be able to tolerate more risk, I was just wondering if you could comment on what the barriers are to I guess, institutional landlordism and tenancy guarantees in Australia, and whether you think that, there's room for those policy actions to, increase in Australia.
I think there are huge disincentives for institutional investment. It's not a profitable area for a range of reasons because of the risk involved in low rental yields and a whole range of other factors. It's been an ongoing challenge despite having alternative models of how to increase institutional investment. It certainly needs to, we need to have a look at negative gearing and look at the incentive structures that are based around that, and having a real debate around how negative gearing can be used differently to create different incentives. And so I think that's...
Sure, thank you. Any other questions or comments? Yes, we have one here, then one at the one at the back.
I mean, one thing that we haven't really spoken about today is how public housing can impact. And I'm just wondering if you can perhaps talk a little bit about that.
Cameron, perhaps you could lead us off on that.
I'm working on a project at the moment funded by the Queensland Mental Health Commission. Last year, Queensland Government brought in this idea of an antisocial behaviour management policy, and essentially if you get 3 strikes within 12 months, you get evicted. They changed the legislation so that social housing landlords have more capacity to control or judge or assess the behaviour of social housing tenants compared to private tenants. And what we find, of course, is that many people with a mental illness are receiving strikes for behaviours that are closely associated with their mental illness, and we see that the Department of Housing are issuing strikes to these people, and there's no consideration to their mental illness, there's no consideration as to engaging with their mental health workers, and the mental health workers often don't even know about the issuing of the strike. So we see that social housing is being delivered to people with mental illness. In fact, overwhelmingly in Queensland, I'm sure it's very similar in South Australia, in order to get priority access to social housing, one needs to demonstrate a range of health and social needs in addition to just a housing need. So in Queensland, and I think it's true elsewhere, the state is allocating housing to people on the basis of profound needs, but then they're allocating that housing in a way that's disconnected and disjointed from the types of services and the responses that many of those tenants need to sustain that tenancy. And what we're arguing in this report is that the state needs to recognise, as it does, that housing is going to people with significant needs, and if it is, then what is the role of social housing? And we're suggesting that perhaps the role of social housing is a function of the broader state departments of enabling health, education, the child protection system, and the mental health system to do what they need to do. And it's the provision of that housing that plays a role for other government departments to be able to work. And certainly that's not the case at the moment. We're suggesting that is a way to think about social housing.
Great, thank you. Chris, do you have anything to add on that?
No, I mean, I think the provision of social housing and public housing is extraordinarily important, but all the years I've been involved in homelessness, so many people have been saying that, and so many people have been saying we need to increase supply, but nothing has happened.
Fair point. Second question or comment?
Frank O'Neill from Unity Housing. I think there is a compatibility between social impact bonds and social housing and affordable housing. Just reflect that most of the people in social housing have guaranteed incomes from the government, albeit not sufficient, but those rents get collected. Superannuation funds have long-term annuities to pay over 20 years. So there's a match in terms of the income coming in and the needs of superannuation funds. How to actually encourage the bond dealers to take the risk is the challenge. And it may be by governments guaranteeing another 1% and allow the community and private market to actually operate detached from government, apart from that, it might work. So it's worth exploring. That's all I wanted to comment.
Thank you very much. I would add that it is an area that seems to be moving fairly rapidly at the moment. Social impacts. Any other questions or comments for our panel? I have a question for Sharon. You talked about the importance of labour markets. Would you favour the American solution, which is deregulate the labour market so you create the capacity for low-wage jobs so people can work their way out of homelessness? A radical solution, but perhaps one in keeping with current policy settings for this federal government.
The whole issue of the working poor who are still housing insecure is a problem we already face in Australia with the high level of casual workers and underemployed. So we still, I don't like to see that as a way forward. I think that would just, that doesn't give people the opportunity to move into a better life. I think it just entrenches them into a dead end and a cycle of poverty and homelessness that they can't extract themselves from. So I would be very worried if we were to go down that pathway.
Any other thoughts from any other panel member?
I just endorse Sharon's view, actually. But
Any other questions or comments from the floor before I bring this session to a close? No? Well, if that's the case, can I ask you to thank our panel members?